can do the verse of refuge and liberation. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And for those who have the text, we're near the bottom of page 251. So we're down to that last paragraph there. You see the heading is, in order to abandon the apprehension of a self, it is necessary to negate its referent object. So here, in this section, Lama Tsongkhapa is making a few points. So what he's saying, right, is that if we want to, in order to realize emptiness, how does it work? What does he say? Negate its referent object, right? So you have to, what he's saying is, you have to first identify the object to be negated, right? Otherwise, emptiness has no meaning, does it? Like, because we're saying it's empty of something. Meaning it's empty of a truly existent I in this case, right? Or empty of an I that exists inherently. And so, and so what he's saying here actually is quite important, isn't it? Because in other words, actually I'll say that, like, he's pointing this out because a lot of people, and you'll see as we go along, I mean, that a lot of, actually it's true if you just read like modern Buddhist books or something, that sometimes, I mean, in Lama Tsongkhapa's time and all throughout Buddhist history, sometimes people misunderstand this point, and it's still true at times. Like, and so what he's saying is, like, you know, for example, if you just empty your mind, that's not emptiness. If you just don't think of anything, that's not emptiness. Right? He's saying emptiness, it's a, you know, well, and in various points in the text, Lama Tsongkhapa says it's difficult to realize emptiness. Especially to realize it in the exact way that Chandrakirti and the other Prasangika philosophers and yogis realized it. And so, so here he's saying we have to, in our own, first understand what is the object to be negated. And as I've been saying, that, like, even if you look at different Buddhist philosophical schools, like tenet systems, right? Like the mind-only school and the, you know, the Sautantrika school and then the Vaibhashika school and so on. And then even within the Madhyamikas, there's the Prasangikas and the Svatantrika Madhyamikas. And the reason I'm just mentioning those is they all have objects to be negated or refuted, but they're all slightly different. Right? And the point being, even those great Buddhist philosophers identified an object to be negated that wasn't the most subtle one, and therefore it didn't become, you know, you don't become liberated from samsara, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, unless you identify the most subtle one. So here he's saying that what you have to do in order to realize emptiness is identify the mistaken object, right? The object that's grasped by ignorance. And then he says, and you have to negate it, right? And he says, if you do not meditate like this on the meaning of having negated the mistaken object, which is the root of being bound in cyclic existence, then even though you meditate on something else that you consider profound, it will not harm the apprehension of a self at all. And so what he's saying there, right, is that, first of all, just earlier in the paragraph above, he said, he's saying why people don't achieve liberation. So he was giving different examples, right? One was, he said earlier, or a little higher up on that page, I think it is, or maybe the previous page, but he had said, some people, right, if they hear, like he's teaching on emptiness, right? And he's saying some people, when they study emptiness, like, don't really develop an interest in actually practicing, right? Even though understanding emptiness is the means of liberation from samsara. Right? And so he was saying, if you study this, and then if you study the actual way of achieving your own well-being and freedom from suffering, and then you just like don't bother to practice, what do you say? You're somebody of low faculties, or something. That's what he said, I think. Then he says, or if you realize this is the way to achieve liberation from samsara, and then you sort of practice only a little bit, like half-heartedly, without much interest, again, that's not going to work, because it's not, achieving liberation is not so easy. Now here he's saying, even if you do have interest, right, in this topic, and you do try to, but you're not careful to correctly identify the object to be negated and then actually negate it, he's saying, but you make up some other profound thing that you're meditating on, then that won't grant you liberation either, right? Because you have to directly negate, you have to find the exact thing that's the root cause of samsara, and you have to actually negate it. Does that make sense? And he's saying if you don't negate that, then your mind will still be grasping at something that exists inherently. And so then it's like, actually, in that text, there's a text by the first Panchen Lama, Losen Choki Gyaltsen, where he has this funny debate between ignorance and ignorance grasping at a self and wisdom. And in that, like, the ignorance grasping at a self says, at one point it teases wisdom and says, like, well, there are a lot of people who think they're practicing you, but they're not even bothering me at all. Like, I'm totally comfortable here, and they say they're meditating on emptiness, but they're leaving me quite alone, and I'm right there in their heart, and then, wisdom's kind of saying something like, well, as soon as they find me, then you're destroyed, or something like that. And that's kind of what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, right? In other words, you have to have there are many different kinds of wisdom, but the wisdom understanding emptiness is the only antidote to self-grasping. And that wisdom has to be very precise and precisely negate, right? And it's like, what does it mean, negate? It means like, it's like, just to use a very simplistic example, like, if everybody here, when you were kids, learned what a full-sized male elephant looks like, right? Like, I remember learning that in school, right? This picture, right? And so if you were asked, like, in this specific room, is there a full-size male elephant? So you could, like, look around. They're not, like, if we asked, is there a mouse, it would be a harder question, maybe. But full-size male elephant's an easy question, right? And it's like you can have a direct, here you can have it's not a question, right? Like, in other words, it's a question, but I mean, you can come to a definitive answer, an absolutely definitive answer. No, there is not a full-size male elephant in this room, right? And all I'm saying is this, it has to be that clear to you. But first you have to know, but if you don't know what you're looking for, then you won't know if it's there or not. Then you have to investigate. I gave an easy investigation, but just my example, but you get the point. Then he says, this is because unless the mind enters the suchness of the selflessness and emptiness, the apprehension of a self cannot possibly be stopped. And because without the object of the apprehension of a self having been negated, you may simply withdraw your mind, going off its object, but that cannot be posited as entering selflessness. And then he clarifies that in the next paragraph. He says, the reason for this is that when the mind gets involved in an object, there are three possible apprehensions. And he goes through three. So one is the apprehension of the observed object as truly existent. Right? So that's a self-grasping. That's a mind of self-grasping. The second is an apprehension of its not being truly existent, right? That's a wisdom realizing emptiness. Then there's a third option, an apprehension that does not qualify it as either of these two. Therefore, although you do not apprehend something as not truly existent, you do not necessarily apprehend it as truly existent. And likewise, although you are not involved in the two selves, you are not necessarily involved in the two selflessnesses. For there are infinite minds remaining in the third category. And so you get the point there. Or if you don't, I'll explain it. What he's saying is, what we need if we want to uproot self-grasping is number two, right? Is an apprehension that recognizes that things absolutely lack, definitively, let's say, lack true existence. But he's saying here, it's not enough that you're just like, if you were just to distract yourself, for example, from grasping at true existence, that's not a wisdom realizing emptiness. In the commentary, they give Geshe Jampa Gyatso gave an example. He said, if you're meditating on the impermanence of a phenomena, right, your mind is apprehending impermanence. That's not you're not specifically grasping at true existence, but the mind realizing impermanence is not a mind realizing the lack of true existence. So it doesn't serve as an antidote to ignorance. Does that make sense? Also, if you were meditating on the emptiness as it's described in other Buddhist tenet systems, that wouldn't serve as an antidote to the subtle grasping at itself. So, for example, get more subtle than that. Like, if you were to, because here you're saying truly existent, right? So if you were meditating on the fact that the self is not unitary, that's not an antidote to the subtle, right? That could still say it's truly existent, but it's not, or it may be truly existent, but it's not unitary, something like that. So it has to be, you have to find the exact object to be negated, and it has to negate that. Any other mode of apprehension of the object is not going to serve as an antidote to grasping at true existence. And then he's going to kind of go through here something that is very similar to what he said before. So he says, the two apprehensions of a self mainly operate while something concrete, a person or a phenomena, is being observed. Therefore, you need to settle that the very bases with respect to which they are mistaken do not exist in the way they are apprehended. Right? So you get the point there. First of all, the way they're apprehended. So you're not, we've gone over this before. One is you're not negating just some kind of intellectually acquired view. You're negating the way in which you yourself experientially and innately or instinctually or grasp, apprehend objects as truly existent. Then he says, otherwise, this is a metaphor Lama Tsongkhapa uses a couple places. He says, otherwise it will be like searching for a thief in a meadow after he has gone to the forest. Right? Does that make sense? So he's saying you're not going to find, another metaphor they sometimes use is like if you have a target, you're doing archery and your target is in the east and you're shooting your arrow west, you'll never hit your target. Right? Here he gives a different metaphor. Right? He says, if you're like somebody robbed your house and you're looking around the meadow for that person, but they're off in the forest, you'll never find them there. Right? Never. It won't happen. And so he's saying you have to identify this object to be negated and negate it in your own in your own apprehension of the object itself. So if you're perceiving a person like yourself, you have to find and then negate that apprehension of yourself. If it were an object like your body, for example, then you would have to find your innate manner of misapprehending your own body and then negate that very precisely. So you can't otherwise if you're grasping at yourself as truly existent but you're gaining some intellectual idea, that's not Consequently, since you bring the mistake to an end by thus meditating on the meaning that has been settled, such an emptiness is the supreme meaning of suchness. With the meaning of suchness settled as something apart from a part that neglects this, only something imputed by one's wishes comes to an end. Therefore, remember, this would deviate from the meaning of the scriptures. And so, right, so you're not negating your wishes. What is it? Like, you're not coming up with some idea and then negating that. That won't serve the function. Then he says, I'll read the heading here. The need to greatly cherish the realization of the view of suchness, having seen that if you stop the apprehension of true existence, you will turn away from cyclic existence. This is what he was saying a bit earlier, I think, in the text also. And again, I think there's an implication here, which is, as I just said a minute ago, there's an implication which is to realize emptiness correctly is not the easiest of tasks. And he's reminding us, he's saying, so why would we want to put great effort into this? And he's saying, if you understand why you would want to put great effort into this, you'll achieve it. Does that make sense? And actually, like, let me go off just on a small tangent before I say that. Like, part of the implication of this is like, actually, if you just look at your own life, like, right, like we put a lot of effort into all different things, don't we? And everybody's different, like some would probably overlap. But we put effort into things, and actually, why do you put effort into things? Like, you have some kind of idea, right? Like that they're useful or meaningful or value. What's that?
Want.
Yeah, that they'll make you happy, I guess, is the idea. And this is an important point. Like, so what Lama Tsongkhapa has been saying throughout this section is, you're not gonna, if you don't understand, like, if you don't think deeply about why realizing emptiness is helpful, then you won't put energy into it, and you won't pursue it deeply, And if you understand, so what he's saying is, if you contemplate. And contemplate means like you think about what the Buddhist teachings say, but you relate them to your own experience and to those around you, right? And so if you keep like investigating, like, well, why am I suffering? And why are other people suffering? Right? This is like the Four Noble Truths, actually, isn't it? He's getting it. What he's saying here is related to the Four Noble Truths, right? And if we don't understand the Four Noble Truths, we're not going to pursue emptiness. So we have to understand and think deeply, like, why do I suffer over and over and over? And when I want to be happy, why is it hard to be happy? And why can't I find a stable happiness? And why can't I find a stable liberation from suffering? And why is it that, like, all the methods that I and, like, my culture and my family and the people around me try don't work? And we don't find stable happiness. We don't find stable liberation from suffering. Which is the fundamental question, right, that the Buddha raised when he taught the Four Noble Truths. And so he's saying here that if you understand, and actually I want to, so if you understand that realizing emptiness is the actual path to liberation, right, from suffering, well, then that would become your main interest, wouldn't it? Like, or certainly one of your main interests. And then also, he's implying something here, which is, there's another implication, which is also if you have some idea, oh, but I can't do that. That's wrong, actually, right? Like, whereas the Buddha when the Buddha taught emptiness, he didn't say that's only for, like, first of all, he was clear. He wasn't saying only certain things are empty, right? The Buddhist teachings are that everything is empty. And then also, the Buddha wasn't saying like only certain people can realize emptiness, right? There's a teaching on Buddha nature which says all sentient beings have Buddha nature, right? From the Prasangika perspective, every sentient being has Buddha nature. So that means you have Buddha nature, right? And it means you can realize emptiness, but it won't be easy, right? And he's saying, like, but if you recognize, well, that's the main way to liberate myself and those I care about from suffering, then you'll develop more and more interest and enthusiasm. And actually, if you look at Lama Tsongkhapa's own life, that's what he did, right? Like, whereas, like, he had all kinds of meditative experiences that were whatever, but he kept studying emptiness, and he kept contemplating emptiness, he kept meditating on emptiness, and eventually he realized emptiness, and became liberated from suffering, and that's what all the great Buddhist teachers of history have done. And not just the great Buddhist teachers, but also like just people who didn't become teachers, but achieved their own freedom from suffering. And that you can do that also, is what he's saying here. It's not some like, and actually part of that is actually it's funny. The more you understand emptiness, the more it makes sense, doesn't it? Because emptiness implies dependent origination. Right? And dependent origination just means if you create the causes for something, it comes about, and if you don't, it doesn't. Right? So if you create the causes for suffering, suffering will come about. If you create the causes for happiness, happiness will come about. If you create the causes for realization of emptiness, then realization of emptiness will come about. If you create the causes for nirvana, nirvana will become your experience. Because things arise due to causes and conditions, and if you create the right causes, then the results will happen. So we can achieve liberation is the point here, right? But what he's saying is there's only one way to achieve liberation, and that's the realization of emptiness, which directly refutes the mind that grasps the true existence. So in that sense, now we can understand, right? So he's saying, the ignorance that apprehends the elaboration of persons, such as men and women, and of phenomena, such as forms and feelings, to be truly existent, is stopped by gaining the view that realizes their emptiness, which is selflessness, and meditating on it. Right? And again, like, that's not something other than your own experience, right? Like, in other words, the grasping at elaborations, right, of persons, male, female, form, feeling, and so on. That's what we do, right? Those are our elaborations. And when we realize emptiness, we're cutting those off from the root, right? Such elaborations of those things being truly existent. Then he says, once you stop that, then your discursive thoughts, the improper mental attention that superimposes things such as attractiveness and repulsiveness, when the object is... So what he's saying here is, if you cut off, through wisdom, if you cut off the apprehension, the mind that grasps, the apprehension of things, elaborating things as truly existent, then the mind that believes that things are truly existent as attractive, or truly existent as repulsive, will also be stopped. Does that make sense? The one will stop the other. And if you stop that, then attachment and aversion, grasping and hatred, pride, jealousy, and so on, will also stop, because all of those come out of the view of the transitory collection, right? Which means the view of grasping at true existence. So all those other mental afflictions will stop. Once these have stopped, actions motivated by it. So in other words, if your mental afflictions stop, then karma, actions motivated them means karma, right? Then you'll stop creating karma. Once you stop creating mental afflictions and karma, rebirth and cyclic existence projected by karma without control is stopped, whereby liberation is achieved. With this in mind, you should generate strong certainty and then decisively seek the view of suchness. So does that make sense? Like, in other words, you have to, and part of this is, actually, we've all heard this teaching, right? I mean, anybody here has heard the Four Noble Truths taught, right? But Lama Tsongkhapa is making a deep point here, right? Which he's saying, we have to, if we really want to realize emptiness, we have to keep contemplating. And actually, if you think about it, it's interesting, right? Like, if you don't cut off ignorance, the view of the transitory collection, then you can't help it. You will give rise to those mental afflictions, right? And like, if you're feeling, we know how much we're miserable. Like, if you're filled with hatred and anger, right, it's a miserable experience, right? If you're overwhelmed with desire, it's a miserable experience. And part of the problem is, like, we can't cut those off unless we realize emptiness. They'll keep coming up. And so what he's saying here is that, right, is that if you want to be liberated from samsara itself, this is the way to do that, right? And he's describing the process by which we enter into samsara through grasping the self, and the process by which we can liberate ourselves. So he says, with karma and klesha, this is a quote from Nagarjuna's text, Root of Wisdom. With karma and kleshas spent, there is freedom. Karma and kleshas arise from conceptions of true existence. Elaborations elaborate those. These are stopped by emptiness. Right? And so kleshas, that means afflictive emotions. Right? That's the Sanskrit word for that. Right? So sometimes we say, what's the root of samsara? Sometimes we say karma and kleshas, karma and mental afflictions. But the root behind those, or below those, is grasping at true existence. And so the only, implied here by Nagarjuna, right? The only way to stop those is the wisdom realizing emptiness. And if you have the wisdom realize, and it's interesting, like, if you realize the wisdom realizing emptiness, then all those other things will stop of their own accord. Does that make sense? And the other day I was listening to like a video of Khensa Rinpoche teaching on, actually the great treatise on Lama, and he was making a point. He was saying, for us as ordinary people, if we keep thinking about these teachings that, as they're taught in this text on emptiness, he was saying, like, what will happen is, experientially, is that, it's not like by just thinking about it a little bit, or your mental afflictions are all going to go away immediately. But he said, they'll decrease. He said, you'll see, like, if you keep thinking about this topic, if you keep thinking about, like, the I is not truly existent from its own side. It exists as merely labeled, but it's empty from its own side. Then, like, the people I'm attached to, or the things I'm attached to, objects I'm attached to, don't exist as I perceive them, right? And they're empty from their own side. And I grasp at them as in a way that isn't accurate, And you keep contemplating how that happens. You keep looking for the object to be negated and meditating on its negation, and you just do that over and over again. He was saying, you'll say, like, your mental afflictions will just decrease some, and you'll find, like, more peace of mind, and longer stretches where you have peace of mind, and your mental afflictions will be less powerful. And then eventually there'll come a point where you can even, like, as they're coming up, or as you're experiencing mental afflictions, if you meditate on it, because you've been doing, if you don't do it ever, of course, or if you do it very rarely, it's not going to work. But if you start doing that often, like every day, then he was saying, like, when you're having a mental affliction, you can apply that antidote, and it will, like, so you'll be grasping, but once you've become familiar with emptiness, right, just by thinking about it over and over and contemplating it over and over, then when you contemplate it while you're having some kind of mental affliction, it will actually decrease it and stop it. It'll give you a break. And then he was saying, then as you keep going, there will eventually come a point where you'll gain the, what's it called, the, like, conceptual realization of emptiness. Not non-conceptual, but a conceptual realization. He was saying, then your mental afflictions will be so much less, humongously less. Like, they'll be, like, have much less power, and you'll have much more freedom. And then eventually through that, as you meditate, then eventually you'll actually realize emptiness directly. And at that point, you reach a point where you're not reborn anymore in samsara through the force of karma and mental afflictions. If you generate bodhicitta at that point, you're born through the power of compassion. That's what, like, and actually that's the idea, like, that's what, like in Tibetan Buddhism, when we talk about, like, a tulku or something, that's what they're talking about, just somebody like that. I mean, some tulkus are already enlightened, they say, but like it's just somebody who realized that, and they're no longer born through the power. That's like, it means they're not born through the power of karma and mental afflictions, they're born through the power of compassion, right? And prayers to benefit others, aspirations to benefit others. Like, and they were just people like you, like, who meditate, on this topic, emptiness. So he says, you need to know those stages of entering into and turning away from cyclic existence, and greatly cherish the realization of the meaning of suchness. However, it will not come through a vague involvement that fails to distinguish well the object of observation. And so you get the point there, right? It will not come through a vague, how does he say it? Vague involvement that fails to distinguish well the object. So what it means, again, is like that we have to think about this over and over and get a clearer and clearer, right? Because actually, it's true, isn't it? Like, if you think about our own experience of emptiness, like, if we, let's sort of say this right, like, vague involvement, right? Actually, because our understanding of emptiness is conceptual at this phase. Right? It's not direct realization until you realize emptiness directly and you become an Arya, right, at the path of seeing. But as we're progressing along, part of this is our understanding is becoming more and more precise. Does that make sense? But that precise understanding only comes about through experience, through you yourself contemplating and meditating. And by contemplating, again, what do I mean by contemplating? I don't mean like some intellectual exercise that's disconnected from your experience. Contemplation means like you're looking for your object in yourself, in your own experience of negation. Right? And then you're challenging it. And you're getting more and more clear. Does that make sense? But you can't do that just by reading a book alone. You have to then, what's the word? Experientially contemplate, maybe that's the right way to say it, over and over again, the meaning of this until you gain some kind of more and more clarity. Any questions up to that point? It's pretty clear.
So, Dr. I'll come back to the start here. The line where it says meaning of having negated the mistaken object. So it looks like the entire effort goes into finding that mistaken object. So what I understand in there is the thought, the object, the conception of the self, and then the difference in the way it's perceived is where emptiness is. So the first, the thought, the conception of a self is as an object, and then there's an object that is apprehended which doesn't look like that, actually. So the gross ignorance should be there, or ignorance should be there, and that ignorance has to be eliminated. That is where the emptiness is.
One thing Lama Tsongkhapa is going to get into in the next few pages is this, so it's interesting, it's very subtle, and he'll get into that. There's a self that does exist, right? Which is the self that's not investigated, right? The self that's merely labeled. So there's a mere appearance of aggregates, right? Of the transitory, so there's a mere appearance of aggregates, let's say, right? And then there's a self that exists, which is merely labeled. And that's actually the self that does conventionally exist, which is not analyzed, right, from ultimate perspective. And then it's interesting, they call that the observed object, right? So in other words, that's what we're looking at, in other words. But then on that merely labeled self, it appears to us as if it exists inherently, or truly, right? And then we believe and we grasp at that false appearance. And so it's quite interesting, isn't it? It's subtle. We're not refuting the merely labeled self, but I think is what you're getting. What we're refuting is the mind grasping at that false appearance, and the false appearance itself actually is being refuted, right, negated. So what's being negated is that false appearance of an inherently existent self, and by the way, the mind that grasps at that also is refuted or negated. But we're not negating the merely labeled I. That's never investigated ultimately, because it's not an ultimate. That's a mere convention.
So it almost sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a thought, a concept, and then there's a perception. At the same moment, the thought would be there and the perception would be there too. And the perception, meaning mode of apprehension I'm talking about, and that mode of, according to this literature, mode of apprehension that we're talking about, the perception, would say, oh, your thought was wrong. That doesn't exist that way.
Yeah, so are you saying so you're negating that mode of apprehension? Right. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
But aspects of mode of apprehension would be there. I mean, you don't know, unless you have a karma abiding at a level which is highest, I mean, at this level where I'm at, I'm thinking about when I meditate in emptiness, there'll be thoughts there, and then there'll be perceptions there. The aspects of those thoughts.
This is quite an important point I think you're getting at, which is, we're about to get into a section on how do you actually meditate. We haven't really gotten to how do you, like in a actual session, how do you meditate on this. He's about to explain some of that. But part of what happens there, there's a whole process that he's going to explain. But one point is, and this is a quite important point also, I think that you're implying, is when the person is actually meditating on emptiness, right, they identify the actual experience of the mode of apprehension of an inherently existent self. Right? So the ignorance, the object to be negated. And then they, through a process of reasoning, negate it. But then there comes a point, at that point, right, where, let me say it the right way, if you, experientially, I think is what you're implying, if you leave it as though there's an I over here that's meditating on emptiness over there, that's not correct, actually. Because then you're still leaving, it's like you've negated some idea, but you're leaving self-grasping alone, which is like in that poem by Lama, First Panchen Lama, right? Like, we're saying, oh, I'm quite comfortable here, And so even for us who have not achieved calm abiding, say, like that, right? Like for us, like the idea is that you, what's it say, right? You do your best to completely absorb into that recognition. So that there's, they use a metaphor, like water poured into water. Right? Like, so you're trying to sort of cultivate, when you actually are meditating on emptiness, a mind where there's not a dualistic, of course in one sense, since it's conceptual, there is a subtle level of dualism there. We can't completely, until you realize emptiness directly, you can't completely transcend your own dualistic way of perceiving things. But on an experiential level, what one is doing is trying to really absorb the mind within that, not finding. They sometimes say, if you think of the investigation, right, and then you negate it, right. So when you negate the self, and so on, there's this. The experience is supposed to be with that you're like. Sorry, say right. Yes, like the mind and emptiness are blended together, and there's not a sense of I who's meditating on emptiness. And if there's still a sense of I meditating on emptiness, then it's not an effective. It's actually when using Lama Tsongkhapa's thing here, then one's sense of it's still vague. It's a vague involvement. That would still be a kind of vague involvement. And part of it is that as we get more and more precise in our understanding of emptiness, and we meditate more and more on it, we contemplate more and more. The idea is that it's supposed to be this let's say right, an experience where all other objects of mind are kind of left behind. And I'll say one other point, of course for somebody who's realized calm abiding, they actually absorb their mind completely in that, and that's different. But even for us, I'll say this, when you're really interested in something, right, when you're really engaged with something, in psychology they have this say flow, right, the mental experience of flow, right? It's like everything else seems to fall away, you don't even hear stuff, right? And that can happen even if it could be something like a hobby, somebody who's really into a hobby or a sport, or when people watch a movie they really like they don't even notice what else is happening. So whereas if we're really engaged deeply in our process of meditating on emptiness, it should at least be like that. I'm just using that analogy. I mean, that's not some Tibetans that use flow and so on, but it should be like that, right? Where it's where you're so deeply engaged in the process that other things fall away. And I'll make one other point too, meditation on emptiness when it's being done, and I'm not talking about somebody who's achieved calm abiding or is realizing emptiness directly or something like that. But when people are really meditating deeply on emptiness, like the teachings say, this is the example of sports, that's a good analogy on it, to be honest. When somebody's, you know, people who go like do a sport, they get really into it. You know, it should be like that. That's my point. Now this is what Tibetans will say actually. Tibetan Lamas will say, like they say, they make this point that when you're really identifying the object to be negated, and then you're really working with it, you know, in an experiential way, like Tibetan Lamas will say, a couple things, like deep experiences happen is one. Like, you know, so another one is, as I was saying, Kensei Rinpoche was pointing out, right, your mental afflictions really fall away for a while. They really decrease. Another is, like Lamas will say, people sometimes become terrified, right? Because they're so habituated to grasping at a self that when they start to negate it, they become afraid, like as if I'm losing myself, you know, and what they say is, like, well, that's not correct in the long run experience. That's a good sign that you're starting to make some progress, in the sense that you're not, of course, like, then you have to recognize I'm not negating, you know, there are all things you can do that to calm yourself down. Like, I'm not negating anything that actually exists. I'm only negating a hallucination. And that hallucination causes all my suffering and all that. But you're starting to get at a deeper level at which you grasp at that false object, and you start to become, they'll say some people feel very afraid or terrified or something, and they just say that's just part of the process. Like, okay, you know, now you're starting to get closer, and then you have to keep going, of course. Other people feel overwhelming joy, you know, like some kind of deep experience of like relief and joy, because like they've been trying to get free from suffering, and now they start to experience like the beginning of that, and they have this experience of like joy. There are like these stories, like there are some stories like many stories like this, but one was from the time of Lama Tsongkhapa. They said he was teaching on emptiness. There was this story, a few people told that, where he was teaching on emptiness, and like, I guess one of his students near the front of the audience was meditating as he was teaching, and suddenly, like in the middle of the teaching, the person started going like this, because they felt like they had lost themselves, you know, like, and they kind of like freaked out, and they started like going, and then I guess Lama Tsongkhapa pointed out what had happened. But so it's not some kind of like, you get the point, it's not like some, I mean, at the beginning we're trying to intellectually understand something, but all of those examples I'm giving are not people who are at the stage of realizing emptiness directly. This is like still conceptual, right? But conceptual in Buddhism is not, it's a really important point. I think the word conceptual is confusing. Because when somebody says conceptual, I think of like intellectual idea. Here, conceptual, like, your dreams are conceptual. You know, like, falling in love is conceptual. Terror is conceptual. Like, so I mean, there's conceptual in the way that Buddhism means it here is not conceptual in an intellectual sense. Like, it's conceptual in the sense that there are still subtle concepts involved. You know, but yeah, it's quite interesting. What's that?
Like an ideology?
Yeah, even our unconscious ideologies are conceptual in the Buddhist sense. Like, so we have these unconscious sort of biases, you know, yeah, and they're very visceral. Like, I guess that's like, if you think of it this way, like, I'll just give an analogy here, like a true one. Like, you know, if you think of like prejudice, for example, right? I'll give an example, like racism, in which people kill people, right? Is conceptual. Right? That's not intellectual, for sure, right? But people kill each other over stuff like that, and that's conceptual. So I mean, conceptual in this sense is not philosophical, purely, right? Or like falling in love, like our deepest feelings, like a person's love for their child, when the child is in danger of dying, is conceptual. Does that make sense? I'm just trying to give a sense when the Buddhist meaning of conceptual is not like, like, you know, sometimes like it comes from like when you're young in the West, if you study like Plato, right, you have the ideal forms and they exist some and some. Buddhism's not talking about that, right? Buddhism's saying conceptual is anything that includes some kind of subtle subject-object dualism, right? So like, my child may die. That's conceptual. You know, and even though it's a humongous, overwhelming feeling, right? Grief is conceptual. You know, hatred is conceptual. So conceptual doesn't mean intellectual. It means like our unconscious biases, our unconscious beliefs, our emotions are all conceptual. Actually.
Anything that creates an image is conception.
Yeah,
So anything that is not a perception is a conception.
yeah,
Let's put it that way.
that's right.
If you go by Pravanavartika's explanation.
That's right.
So what if, so what if you don't have a language to project things? So is it conceptual? Like you have like death or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. So like, yeah, Ken Rinpoche made a point. I once asked him about that because I was confused about that point. And what Ken Rinpoche was said was, in this sense, like so, and the way he put it was, he said, this is not unique to human language. Like in other words, and he gave an analogy. He said animals and hungry ghosts and so on. That from a Buddhist perspective, they have a language, and that we're not talking about like that they have like a language we could translate into English or something or whatever. But like, yeah, that like when a mouse sees a cat and starts to run away, that's conceptual. Maybe is the right way to say it. In other words, they have a concept of danger. We use the word danger. You know, that's my word. But they have what I would call a sense of danger. They have their own internal, and it's interesting. He used the word language. Even an insect, when you pound the table and it runs away from your hand, like if an insect were right here and you pounded the table very hard, the insect would start to run away. Even ants do that, right? If you slap the ground near an ant, the ant runs. Like so, and what they're saying is, what Buddhism would say is that's conceptual on the part of the ant. So conceptual is a very deep. It's that deep even, and that even insects have it. You know.
But if let's say you realize relative truth, like this relationship to that, and then also like so, what I'm saying, and then you have to go to the second level of emptiness. You don't need conception to realize that.
I guess at the beginning, I guess it's important too. Like so, of course, when somebody realizes emptiness directly on the path of seeing, they realize it in a totally non-conceptual way. It's like a direct perception of emptiness. But for us, up until that point, actually, what's happening is, like, all of us here. Actually, we've been studying this topic. Like, we have a concept, some conception. If I say, if you were to ask yourself, like, if you were to go sit down and think, well, what is emptiness? All of us here have some conceptual image, an idea in our mind. Like we would come up with some, and it's not just intellectual. It's like a feeling, maybe. It's an image. It's an idea. Or and it may not be entirely accurate, of course, but it's not entirely inaccurate either.
Yeah.
And what happens is, according to this system, this way of explaining it, is that mental image that we have of emptiness. Right now it's a mental image, right? And then it's going to become, as we continue meditating and contemplating and studying and thinking and, meditating in this deep experiential way, that image, even though it says vague, right? Like ours is vague. It's still a mental image, but it's going to become closer and closer to what emptiness actually is, to the actual nature of emptiness. And it's going to become more and more subtle and more precise. And then they say, like, on the path of, so it's like, if you say the path of accumulation, preparation, and then the path of seeing, on the path of preparation, that person still has it's still conceptual, it's still a mental image, but it's becoming very, very, like, more and more extremely subtle. And the person, who's far along on the path of preparation, their mental image is still a mental image of emptiness, but for us, it would be unimaginably subtle. And then there comes a point where that very subtle mental image, they break through into the direct perception. But so until that point, it's still some kind of mental image. So there's still a very subtle conceptuality until the path of seeing. That's what I'm saying.
It can be like an atom,
What's that?
like small atoms.
Almost like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very more and more subtle. Yeah,
Yeah.
you get it. That's right. Yeah, and so that's what he's saying. So in other words, it's not enough to have a vague idea, and part of it is we all start with a vague idea. But and that's why Ken Rinpoche was saying that point, you have to meditate every day. That was his suggestion. If you meditate every day on emptiness, you study a little bit every day, and you keep contemplating it. And then as you go about your day, you're checking with your own experience of looking for the I, noticing the object you're trying to find the object of negation, even as you're going around, somebody cuts in front of you on the road, and some feeling comes to you, is that the object of negation? you're at work and somebody says something you don't like. You think, is that the object of negation? Like, what is that like in my experience? Then you're going to become more and more, what's the word? You're going to become better and better at this. And then like something good happens to you, you think, oh, that's awesome, I got what I want. And you think, well, what's that I that got what it wants? How does it exist? Right? You start asking those kind of questions over and over, and you're getting closer and closer then. And then you start applying the reasonings that we're about to get into. And again, your mental image will become more and more close to what emptiness is, more and more precise, less vague and more precise.
But wouldn't that be kind of like disattachment? Disattachment to your feelings and emotions and just being?
In a way, yeah. Yeah, and it's different, that it's not the same. You're right. In other words, like sometimes especially like when people are just practicing like mindfulness, let's say, right? Like simple, like mindfulness of breathing and mindfulness of sensations or something. Like up to that point, there is a quality of just like noticing, right? Oh, I'm feeling angry or sad, and when you're meditating on emptiness, you don't just notice it. You're right. In other words, like, and you do kind of. Actually, it's not so much disassociating from the feelings though, as like. I'm trying to use a metaphor here. Like, actually, this is my metaphor for like this is my way. I'm just using an example or a metaphor. Like, if there were like a plant in the garden, right? Like if you were practicing mindfulness, would be like looking at the plant and noticing it, like its color, its whatever, right? If you're just doing mindfulness of sensation, that would be a sensation, right? Your visual sensation. This is more like you're analyzing, actually, right? You're analyzing in what sense does that plant exist, and eventually, if you realize emptiness, the plant will stop appearing to you. What will appear to you is the emptiness of the plant. So you're right, but it's not really disassociating. It's more like uproot. It's not like with the plant uprooting. It would be like, but it's like if you're having, say I'm angry, right? There's one approach where the person would just notice the anger, right, and observe it. This is not that. This is saying, you would actually be saying to yourself, but it's also not, it's not like repressing the anger or hiding from it either. It's actually investigating the anger. So you're actually going towards the anger, and you're saying, all right, I'm angry. But who's really angry? And how am I, like, who's the I who's angry? Who's the object that I'm angry at? What's the nature of the anger? In what way does that I that feels angry exist? Is that I that I'm perceiving that is angry, is that even real or not? And if it's real, in what way is it real? And how does it exist? And is it possible even that I exists? So you're not like suppressing the anger in the sense of like repressing it or something, but you're also not just observing it. And it's a different meditation technique. In this meditation technique, you're taking that as the object of analysis, and then you're analyzing either the anger or the I that's angry, depends which one you want to analyze. So it's a very different, you're right, it's a very different, and it's not disassociating, so not, but it is very different than just observing. It's really analysis. But it's analyzing your own experience in a very experiential way. It's not intellectual either. It's like, there's an intellectual element, but what you'd be doing is saying, well, who's the I that's angry? In what way does that I exist? And what they say is if you correctly understand emptiness, through that analysis, the anger will disappear. And what will replace it is an experience of wisdom in that moment. You'll have an actual experience of wisdom. But it'll be experiential, not just an intellectual exercise. But does that answer your question? Because it is different, though, you're right, than just sort of observing. It's a whole different it's a different meditation technique in a way. Right. So now, Lama Tsongkhapa, this is kind of where we're getting into anyway, so I'll start it, because we've been talking about it. The next section on page 253 is the stages of generating the two views of selflessness. And then he says, the stages themselves. So, Oh, okay, and here I said this last time, but I'll just go over it because this is where he actually goes into detail. He says, as for the stages in which the two apprehensions, so what are the two apprehensions of a self, right? Remember, they're the self of, and in the Majjhimaka, Prasangika Majjhimaka view, these two views are equally subtle, right? But you can conceptually differentiate them for the sake of discussion. And one is the selflessness of phenomena, and the other is the selflessness of persons, and mostly meaning yourself. So the selflessness of you yourself, and then the selflessness of phenomena. And phenomena can include phenomena that are within your own continuum, like for example an ear lobe is a phenomena, or it can be something outside your own continuum, like a pen, right? But those are both phenomena. And then person is I, me. And so what he's saying here is, as for the stages in which the two apprehensions of a self arise, the apprehension of a self of phenomena generates the apprehension of a self of persons. And so that's the first half of this point he's making. So what he's saying here is this, is in terms of ignorance, right, the grasping at a self, itself, first we perceive a self of phenomena. And that means, like, first your aggregates appear to you, right? Sometimes your focus is on your body, like, so you grasp at it truly, so your body appears to you as if it's truly existent, and you grasp at that. Other times it's your mind, right? Like, or is both a combination, right? So, like, using the example we just gave, right? Like, so say we use the example anger, I was just talking about, right? So like anger, right? So when one is angry, right? Like there's an apprehension of the mind that's angry, and maybe also the body, right? You're feeling agitated. And those seem to be concrete. They seem to be truly existing. And then, on the basis of the appearance of the aggregates, one imputes I. Right? One apprehends a truly existent self. And so then you say, I'm angry. So that's what he's saying here. In terms of how the apprehension of a self arises, first it's, when he says, in this sense, when he says phenomena, he means your own aggregates, right, mostly. Well, actually, in this case, it is those. External phenomena aren't going to lead to an apprehension of an I, right? So you perceive your own aggregates as truly existent, and then you perceive yourself as truly existent. And that keeps happening, right? It's like a cyclical. Then he says, in terms of, next, still, when you engage in suchness of selflessness, you must first generate the view of the selflessness of persons, and then after that, generate the view realizing the selflessness of phenomena. And so, does that make sense? So what he's saying, when people are actually practicing emptiness, meditation, contemplation, meditation, the sequence is that first they realize the emptiness of themselves. Then they realize the emptiness of other phenomena. And then he's going to get, and now I'll keep going because he explains why, because you're probably wondering why. So first he quotes Nagarjuna's precious garland, which says, persons aren't earth nor water, aren't fire, wind, nor space, aren't consciousness. If they are none of these, what could persons be other than that? Since beings are composites of the 6 elements, they are not real. Exactly like that, each element is a composite too, and therefore is not real either. So there, you can see Nagarjuna is saying, he's just doing it in that order, right? He's saying first you're recognizing the person doesn't inherently exist on its elements, right? Here he's saying the elements of a person are the elements of the body, right? Are in Buddhist dharma is earth, water, fire, wind, and space, the 5 elements, and then consciousness is the 6th. And he's saying if you search those, you won't find an inherently existent I. Right? So the person meditates in that way and realizes there is no inherently existent I. Because it's a composite. Right? It's merely labeled actually on the aggregation of those. And then he says, once one has realized that, then one can recognize, well, also each of those is a composite, right? The earth element of the body, well, there are a lot of different parts of that, so it's a composite, and it's merely labeled and so on. And so you can see Nagarjuna is saying, first you realize the emptiness of the self, and then you realize the emptiness of the elements themselves. Then, and Lama Tsongkhapa does this a lot, doesn't he? Then he says, in this, you'll see, and we've been noticing this in this text, in this section. Then he says, clear words, which is a text by Chandrakirti. So he's saying then, he goes through Chandrakirti's clear words, Buddha Palita and Shantideva also make the same point. Right, so he's saying there's consensus. He's like making a point, I'm not just saying that because Nagarjuna said it. All the great Prasangika philosophers say the same thing. And then he makes an interesting point. He says, now he's saying, so why is that, right? And he says, the reason why it must be done like this is that there is no difference, is that although there is no difference in subtlety with regard to the selflessness being ascertained, right? So the selflessness of persons and the selfless phenomena are equally subtle. It's not that one is subtler than the other, because you could think that, right? Oh, maybe it's because the one is subtle. And then he says, it's due to the essentials of the substratum, it is easier to ascertain the basis of persons and more difficult regarding the ascertainment in relation to phenomena. And then he gives an analogy at some point where he says, what he's saying here is this. He gives the analogy of a reflection. And in the commentary they explain it. So like, I say it the right way. Like, if you want to understand that something doesn't exist from its own side inherently, right? If you look at your reflection in the mirror, right, he gives the analogy of a reflection, right? So in the morning, if you look at your reflection in the mirror when you're in a mirror, right, or whatever, and you look at it, and you can actually, it's not that difficult to recognize, well, there's not really a me there in the mirror, it's just a reflection. Right? That's pretty easy, right? And then there are other traditional metaphors, like a mirage, right? Like a mirage appears like it's really water from its own side, but if you contemplate, it's not very hard to recognize, well, there's no water there, it's the middle of the desert. Right? Or a rainbow, right? Like, you know, actually, a rainbow, it's always fun, right? You see a rainbow, oh, look, there's a rainbow. And then if you contemplate, you can recognize, well, you know, we know this, right? A rainbow appears due to like refraction of light in water droplets, right? Because that's why they come after rain, right? There's water droplets in the air, and so you can know, well, it's just a refraction. There's no real thing there. If I went there, there's nothing I could touch, right, and find. Or like a hologram, right? Like if you see a hologram of a person, it looks like a person, but it's not hard to recognize. You know, if you go and like try to touch the hologram, and if you search for like, you know, if you were to search for like the, whatever, the brain of the hologram, you're not going to find it, right? So certain phenomena are easier, and certain phenomena are harder to realize that they lack inherent nature. And what he's saying is, those kind of phenomena are easy. Person, yourself, is not easy, but it's easier than form or feeling, like than a feeling. And part of that is that it's composite, right? That in other words, that we can recognize pretty easily that the self, I, is labeled on the aggregates, and that we have a body and a mind and so on. And if you look in Buddhist tenet systems, this is true actually. Like other Buddhist tenet systems have an easier time refuting that the I exists independently, but they still hold on to, like, you know, some hold on to that there are atoms that exist independently. Others hold on to that consciousness exists independently. They tend to hold on to objects as if they exist independently more subtly than the person. So what he's saying is just by its nature, the substratum or the phenomena, or the thing of a person is a little bit easier to realize the emptiness of than objects. And then,
what does substratum mean?
Substratum means like the thing being projected upon, like so. It's actually, one way of saying it is like, where does he say it here? I'm just trying to go back.
Due to the essentials of the substratum.
Yeah. So one way of saying it is, like I would take that due to the essential substratum, it is easier. Like, so it's like due to the nature of the thing being, of the observed object. That's the way I would say it. So like, the object of observation of grasping at a self is the merely labeled self. Whereas the object of observation or the substratum of the eyeball is the merely labeled eyeball or something like that. So it's the thing that does exist. You know, the merely labeled phenomena that does exist is the substratum, I think there. And then, you know, again, Lama Tsongkhapa does this. So he had said, right, Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Buddhapalita, and Shantideva say it this way. Now he says the Buddha does too, in case there was any doubt. So he quotes the King of Meditative Stabilization Sutra. Says, just as you know the notion of a self, just as you know the notion of self, apply it to everything mentally. The entityness of phenomena is completely pure like space. All of them are known through one, and all of them are seen through one. Right, so he's saying first realize it in relation to the self, then realize it in relation to phenomena. That's clear there. Actually, maybe I'll take a moment. I'm just going to use the restroom quick. I'll focus better if I do that.
Observation, it's not the thing you're looking at, it's,
Two people standing side by side do not see the same angle coming into your eyes different. Therefore, different.
you say that about all phenomena now?
Couldn't we? We're all coming from that, like.
That's kind of the point.
Very good. Good. I actually hadn't got that far. Thank you. No, it's not.
I think that's why they, equate phenomena with rainbows, moons and waterfalls and all that stuff. It's all, but appearances as opposed to a real moon or real.
Yeah, the physics.
Should we come back? Let's start again. Chat war.
So the aggregates, when you talk about the aggregates, are you talking about the preferred aggregates or just the plain aggregates?
The what aggregate? Sorry.
Preferred aggregates or just the aggregates with forks?
Oh yeah. So there's any aggregates. Yeah.
So even though if the aggregates are preferred, you can still project things into it.
Yeah. So one way of differentiating it is like for ourselves, of course, we just have the impure five aggregates, right? Conditioned by karma and mental afflictions. But a couple things. One is when we see a Buddha, Buddha has purified aggregates, but from their own side, of course, the Buddha only perceives a merely labeled, the conventionally existent I. They don't perceive something that doesn't exist. You know, they don't grasp, have something. But we do. Like on the Buddha, we project a truly existent Buddha, existing from its own side, right? Independent. So in that sense, with the purified aggregates, an ignorant person still projects inherent existence on them. The Buddha still has a self, but it's a merely, they only have the they don't grasp at any kind of truly existent self at all, of course. But they do have a merely label, right? Still the Buddha can say, I went to Shravasti in India to teach others. And they mean the merely labeled I went to the merely labeled Shravasti to teach the merely labeled others, something
But
like
the
that.
delusion doesn't appear.
What's that?
The delusions don't
Yeah,
appear.
for them it doesn't even appear.
That's cool. That's nice.
Yeah, they have no appearance like that at all.
Yeah.
It just reminded me, and it come up in my mind earlier, I don't remember the meditator's name, but some powerful meditator who'd get so absorbed, he'd have to kind of check in, see if he was still there. He'd call out his own name, like, Eric, oh yes, okay, right, yeah.
One other thing I'll mention about this point about realizing the I, emptiness of the self, and then realizing the emptiness of phenomena, is one interesting point. Somebody, again, like as Ken Rinpoche made this point, a couple of points about this. One is, and it's clear, I think, in these quotes, but I just want to point it out in case it's not clear. One point is, it's not saying that by realizing the emptiness of yourself, you've already realized the emptiness of phenomena. That's not what this is saying. Like, although the emptiness has the same taste, they sometimes say, the same flavor, the same quality, the way it actually works is you realize, there's a basis, right? So you've been analyzing, does this I, that you have a grasping at a truly existent I. And then you've been meditating, analyzing, does that truly exist? And then when you realize it doesn't, right, there's a realization of emptiness. And then what this is implying is this, so then when you arise from that meditation, right, and then like say you look and you see, it says here, you notice your own, whether it's an internal phenomena like your eyes or ears, or an external phenomena like a pen, it'll appear to you as if, like, let's say you just meditate on emptiness and realize emptiness, and then you look down and you see a book, right? The book will still appear to you as if it's truly existent from its own side, inherently existent from its own side. And what they're saying is this, is whatever reasoning you did, like, so in the example that Nagarjuna gave, let's say you realized emptiness through the reasoning Nagarjuna gave, that it's merely labeled on a composite, right, of earth, water, wind, fire, air, space, and consciousness. And so, then you would use the same reasoning, because that just worked for you. Your mind was able to grasp emptiness or understand emptiness because of this reasoning. So then you would look at the book and you would realize it's also a composite. It's made up of covers, of all these different pages, of different words, of parts of letters, right? And by that same reasoning, because your mind just was so familiar with that and it just worked for your mind, that same reasoning then would allow you to realize the emptiness of the book, that the book doesn't exist inherently from its own side. And then you would look at the microphone and you would say, wow, that's a composite. And then you could realize the emptiness of the microphone. Does that make sense? So it's like whatever reasoning you use to realize the emptiness of yourself, you could then apply that reasoning and you would easily realize the emptiness of other phenomena. And so that's the method, is how it works. And so then he says here, Lama Tsongkhapa says here, once you know well the mode of subsistence of the I with regard to which discrimination, with regard to the self, thinking I, operates, you should then apply its reasoning, right? Meaning that whatever reasoning you use, apply that same reasoning to internal phenomena such as the eyes and ears, and to external phenomena such as pots. Tibetans always use pots or pillars. It's the cultural. So I guess that goes back a long time. So you apply the same reasoning you just used, and you realize the emptiness of other phenomena. Yes.
So did you say when you realize the emptiness of an object, you can't see it anymore?
What they say is this: is when you realize the emptiness of a phenomena, I wouldn't say that you can't see it anymore. What I would say is, it doesn't appear to you. The object itself doesn't appear during that meditative absorption or meditative concentration. So it's not that you can't, like, it'll again appear when you come out of meditative absorption, but at the time when you're realizing the emptiness, your mind is totally focused on the lack or emptiness of true existence, so the object itself isn't appearing, because your mind is absorbed in that. But then when you come out of the focus on that, again, the object will appear, and it'll even appear as if it were truly existent.
That'd be pretty weird if it didn't.
Yeah, but so it's just like, and in a way, it's like the analogy, because they sometimes make a point of that. Like sometimes people misunderstand that and think, therefore, nothing exists or something. And what they're saying is, no, it's more like, if you're really focused on, if you're at the beach, for example, and you're really focused on, and you're like laying on the back, really like totally focused on the sky, you're not seeing the water. But it doesn't mean the water doesn't exist. It's just you're not perceiving it because you're totally focused on something else. So here you're totally focused on emptiness, so nothing else is appearing to you. But that's because your mind is absorbed in a realization of a particular, of the emptiness of something. But it's not that conventionally existing thing doesn't exist. It's just not appearing to you because you're focused on emptiness. Does that make sense?
It does
Okay.
make sense, but then, so then when you come back out of the meditative state, there's then the higher awareness of the lack of intrinsic nature in the object.
And that's when they say things, sometimes they'll say, for somebody who's realized emptiness, things appear in an illusion-like manner. And what that means is, for that person, so let's say you were just meditating on emptiness, and you were only appearing, all that was appearing to you was emptiness, no conventional phenomena. None of the conventionally sort of existent pots and pillars were appearing to you. Then when you come out of that meditation, of course, like, let's say you open your eyes and you see people in chairs, and you hear sounds, and you smell, tastes, and all your senses, you perceive things, And what they say is, for that person at that time, the experience, this is just interesting, I think, the experience is like, they sometimes give an analogy, they say it's like it'd be like somebody who created a hologram who then is perceiving the holograms. It's like they know they're not real because they know they're creating it. But it still appears to them. Like if you created a hologram, you would see the hologram. But you would know it's not real from its own, like, and so they don't give rise, like, and they often give this analogy. They say, like, if, there's often that traditional analogy, actually Ken Rinpoche taught it last year at the teachings on Majjhimika, where there's this analogy of, like, if somebody goes to a magical show, right, and somebody creates an illusory, very attractive person, the audience may become like, they can even like become very attached to that person and think, oh, I want that person to like me, and I want to go on a date with them or something, like, the person doesn't exist, right? It's an illusion, right? Like a hologram, say, a holographic person. Somebody could think, oh, I hope they'll marry me, or something, right? But the person who programmed that and sort of made it up, well, they're not going to think, oh, I hope they'll love me, because they know it's not a real person from its own side, that they created it. That, in a sense, for the person who just realized emptiness, who then perceives objects, they understand how their mind is giving rise to this appearance of true existence, but things don't exist in that truly existent way. They don't grasp at that. But the things still appear to them. And they still have appearances of, food and cars and friends and enemies. But they don't believe that a friend is a truly existent friend, from their own side, and will always be a friend. They don't believe an enemy is a truly existent enemy who's inherently bad from their own side. They don't believe that, so they don't grasp at things, and they don't become, what's the word? They don't become angry in the same way, or they don't become grasping in the same way. When they have money, they don't think of, what's the word? Like, the money still appears to them. If you gave them a $100 bill, they would still see a $100 bill, of course.
So they wander around in a holographic world?
In a world that's, illusion-like. Yeah, an illusion-like appearance. Yeah, they wander around in a world that's illusion-like.
Like
And
dreaming.
what's that?
Like dreaming.
Yeah, that's another analogy that's sometimes used. And for them, you can imagine, right? They're wandering around a world where, actually, it's a little like this. I sometimes think of it this way. Like, when, like, it's like when you see a child, and the child is really, like, imagine you see a child who's, like, screaming because they lost in a video game. Right? Like, they look at us a bit like that, I think. You know, like, you just lost at something that wasn't, like, we look at a child, we think like, oh, you're screaming and crying because you lost in a video game. Like, it's okay, you know, like, and but you're thinking like, you know, all this child doesn't realize. They think it's real. Like, they think they lost something real, but it's just a video game. I think, I'm just using an analogy. I think that such a person as that, what we're talking, somebody who's realized emptiness would be looking at us, and we're all upset because we lost some money. You know, and they would be looking at the same way, like, money isn't really real. It's just labeled. You know, it's just a conceptual. It only exists through the power of the conceptual mind. But you're so upset that you lost the money that only exists through the power, that only ever did exist through the power of the conceptual mind, merely labeled by the. So they would, yeah. So in that sense, and they would have. It would be easier for them to have more compassion for the suffering of others.
Except for they're not real.
Yeah, it's true. They're not real. It's true.
So can I, so
But they're
this is really
conventionally
stupid,
real.
but like.
But they exist conventionally.
When I was young and was a Catholic, right, and they all talk about heaven and stuff like that, and I thought there could not be a more boring place than people hanging out on clouds, playing harps and singing. I mean, for eternity. You know what I mean? Oh my God, please, no, I'll take help. But, sorry, but, you know, I'm just saying. So like walking around in a holographic world sounds kind of weird too. What's the point?
Because I think from a Buddhist perspective, really, actually I'll say it this way, like, well, I'll start with this. I think the point is compassion. The point is love, really. Like, and it's like, I'm trying to say it the right way, like, it's like, because if all the people, like, let's say it right, if other people believing the like, if there were a holographic monsters or something, right, and if everybody else believing they were real is tormenting those people, like, in one sense it'd be unbearable, right, like, and you would feel, I have to go and try to help people realize it's just a hologram, using that metaphor. And so, in a sense, I'm just using this metaphor, like, there is the purpose is very deep because you love those people. And you have genuine, I mean, it's not like I don't mean like love in some abstract way, like you really love them. You know, and like, so you want to help them not be afraid. And not like run off a cliff because, you know, and also, I guess I'll give one more point to this. Also, so one is that. Then there's another point, which is, if you understand emptiness, you understand dependent origination. And if you understand dependent origination, you understand emptiness. So another way of saying it is, it's starting to sound like the Matrix now, but it's fun. But another point of this is, the more deeply you understand emptiness, using our metaphor of the hologram, which is again just a metaphor, it's like the more you progress in that, the more you understand how to program the projector, so to speak. And so that's, in a way, if you look at like the activity of, it's not actually like, part of the idea is, if you look at all the different bodhisattvas and Buddhas and things like that, they're all actually, like, I think this is fascinating in a way. They all manifest in very different ways. And part of the idea there is like, imagine this, like imagine if you personally, like, had that realization, right? And then you would think, well, okay, who do I most need to help? And how would I help them? And you have like infinite capacity for creativity. And you have this ability to, like, in that sense, you can artistically create, like, you know, our artist can just, like, an ordinary artist can just use whatever, like sculpture or pen or paper or art, what's it called, paint, or, but if you understand dependent origination in a very deep way and how the process of karma causes certain projections to happen, then you gain this ability, like, you can start to program the projector, so to speak. I'm using this metaphor, right? And like, who do I want to help and how would I help them? And what would I creatively sort of, what's the word? Creatively manifest as? Or creatively manifest together with them in order to help them see what they don't yet see. And then, like, it becomes, I think it's a fascinating process then, like, where you know, you look at like, and like actually if you look at, I'm just going to give an analogy here, it's an interesting question, so I'll just say it, like, you think of Tara, I'm just picking one example, right, like, and you study like the history of Tara in the scriptures, you see this, like she was a princess at first who was generous and didn't understand emptiness yet, right, and she generated compassion and she kept offering to people, and then, you know, somebody said, you know, and then like, what was it, she created so much merit that she was able to generate bodhicitta, right? And then that monk said to her, oh, well, now you can become a man, you have so much merit. And she said, not only do I not want to become a man, but I'm going to stay a woman from now all the way until I become a Buddha, and when I'm a Buddha, I'll manifest as a woman, right? And that was her vow then. But then if you look at her story over, like she eventually realizes emptiness and then goes through all these different levels of spiritual evolution to become a Buddha. But part of what's interesting if you read those stories is, you know, so she starts manifesting, at some point she manifests very peacefully. Then she manifests green. You know, then she manifests like fierce red dancing forms and so on. And part of this is like she starts being able to create, I think those are, if you take that as like, I'm using Tara as an example, that she starts being able to manifest in infinite different ways in order to communicate and interact with infinite different people, right? So sometimes she's the green goddess of a forest, and sometimes she's the red dancing fierce goddess who freaks people out and wakes them up, and sometimes she's the white goddess who like pacifies where people are agitated. Sometimes somebody's dying and she helps them have a longer life, and because she knows dependent origination and she knows none of this, it's like using your point, if she's living in a holographic world, she's like, well, I can do all kinds of stuff then. That's beautiful and creative and will wake people up and will wake up different kinds of people. And this person will never wake up from a peaceful white goddess, but a red goddess who knocks them on the head might get them up, you know, and this other person may never, so like, and her ability to manifest in these creative, beautiful, varied, infinitely sort of, what's the word? Infinitely creative ways increases and increases as she progresses on the path. So that would be the point. And like, to me, that's a cool point. Like, you know, and like, imagine that, like having to be, and you know, you look at like, you know, like Manjushri, right? And like, you know, he's very different. He holds a sword and all that in some pictures. But then sometimes he manifests as Yamantaka with this like on fire and looks terrifying, you know, and like, because it's like, he was like, well, that's the only, you know, there are some people where that's the only way they're going to stop doing horrible things, is they have to see something that really freaks them out or whatever. Like, I'm just using this, obviously I'm talking about words here, but I never heard Lama say freaks them out. But I guess the point I'm making is like, it's like they can, what's the word, like, they can be infinitely creative out of love for others and to help others awaken. You know, if you think of it using that metaphor of a hologram, it's like, well, you can create, if you could create any hologram you want over time, you know, that becomes quite an interesting question. Well, what would I create to help other people wake up? Especially the people I love. And eventually who I love is everybody. But that's a fascinating question, you know, and like, you know, and like, do I want to manifest as, you know, and like it's different, right? Like Medicine Buddha said, I want to create this medicinal form that holds medicine in his bowl and that creates a pure land filled with medicine, you know, and then somebody else said, oh, I want to have one that people are dancing in the sky, you know, like I want to create a place where everybody's like dancing wildly in blue and red forms. And somebody else says, no, I want to have like a green place in a forest, like, because others will wake up in that, you know, different people will wake up in different ways or something. And I'm just using this as an example, right? So that would be the point, is like infinite, and actually in the, what's that called? The Samadhavajra's prayer, it talks about, you know, the delusions of beings are limitless, so may my aspiration to benefit them be limitless. You know, and they're infinitely varied, so may my, you know, so like may my compassion activity be infinitely varied. You know, and it's fascinating. Then it's like quite interesting, isn't it? So I think that would be the point. It's not, so it's not, like the point would not be, yeah, the point would be like, you know, when you first realize it, it's just like, I mean, I think like, it's just like your own experience of, wow, this is like not, things don't exist how I thought. But then the person has to work with the implications of that. And especially at the higher bodhisattva bhumis, which if you study in the different texts or something, they're able to do. They describe like the activities that those bodhisattvas are able. Like any bodhisattva is able to do amazing activities to benefit others. But the more you progress on the path, the more skill you get at being able to creatively manifest in ways that will benefit more varied people's varied. Because again, like once you project and believe in inherent existence, you can create any kind of insane elaboration, right? Like the delusions of beings are limitless because we can create limitless stupidity, and limitless like weird, crazy elaborations of ignorance and stupidity. But the interesting thing about the bodhisattva path is that bodhisattvas cultivate the ability to create, therefore, infinitely varied and beautifully creative ways of teaching and helping and waking others up, and again, like some teach through like, scholarly text, but some teach through a flower or something, like, there are bodhisattva pure lands, they say, or Buddha pure lands where like somehow the flower, like helps people realize emptiness or something. Like, they're all different like kinds of pure lands and different kinds of even impure lands manifesting, and I think even like, I was thinking of Manjushri for some reason, because he also is like one who, they say like his vow was that he would like, one of his vows was like, when he said, when I become a Buddha, I'll manifest as a bodhisattva, and wherever Buddhas are teaching, I'll say, how about emptiness? Why don't you teach about emptiness? People don't understand emptiness. What about this question about emptiness? They'll ask all kinds of difficult questions to the Buddhas about emptiness, because others need to hear those questions. Like, they're like, well, because people are too stupid to even ask the right question, so I'll ask the question for them, and then they'll hear the answer and they'll wake up, because the Buddha will answer my question, like, because people don't know what even to ask or something, and you see the difference between him and Tara. I mean, they're both beautiful, but they're different, and so I think that's part of it. Does that make sense?
Two questions. One is, you mentioned compassion, so isn't compassion also an object of negation? In that sense, so if we're thinking compassion towards people, other beings, but that also is an object to be negated, so is that where we're in danger of nihilism, where we're like not caring? That's one question. Second question is, I understand like maybe it's easier to identify the self as, to understand that as the object of negation, but wouldn't it be more difficult to be the object to be negated once you realize, because you're more attached to the self than a phenomenon?
In regards to the first question, first I'll say, what's important, it's like very subtle but important distinction is that, like, compassion exists. So compassion is not the object to be negated, but truly existing compassion, or a compassion that exists from its own side, inherently that would be the object to be negated. And so compassion does exist conventionally, right? And how does it exist? Right, it exists due to causes, like as dependent origination, due to all kinds of causes and conditions. There's the appearance of compassion, and then we label, oh, that's compassion. That exists. But if we say then compassion exists inherently from its own side, that would be the object of negation. And there's even the famous, well, actually, it says it in various prayers, but in Lama Tsongkhapa's name mantra, it's there are different ways they translate it, but the first line of that verse is, you are Avalokiteshvara, great treasure of, some say not objectifying compassion, or great treasure of objectless compassion. They translate it different ways. But what they're saying there is, Lama Tsongkhapa and Avalokiteshvara do have compassion, but it's a compassion that recognizes the lack of inherent existence of like it recognizes that the person feeling compassion, the object of compassion, and the compassion itself are dependently arisen and lack any inherent existence, and that's the kind of compassion they have. So they do have conventionally, even like Avalokiteshvara has conventionally existent compassion, but he doesn't grasp what a truly existing compassion and a truly existent I. Because as soon as you have the truly existent I, right, then there's a truly existent other, and they're inherently separate, and then I have this concrete. So they're saying that kind of the compassion that's truly existent from its own side and has inherent nature, that is the object of negation. But compassion itself does exist, so that's one point. And then the second question you had was like, so you said would it be harder maybe was that what you kind of said, to realize the emptiness of the person because?
Maybe easier to identify, to understand the object of negation, to first understand that from the self rather than phenomena. But maybe harder to then negate it because you have stronger attachment for the self.
Yeah, to be honest, I've wondered that same question. Like I sort of thought, well, why, oh yeah, but it seems like you grasp at it so strongly. So I wondered that myself. I guess maybe that's why Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, he's kind of saying, well, I'm saying this, the Buddha said it, Nagarjuna said it, Chandrakirti. He said, I think Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, maybe for people like us who wonder that, he's saying, trust me, like the Buddha said it this way, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying it, Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Buddhapalita, and Shantideva are saying. So I think maybe Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, it could seem that way, but trust me, this is the order. It goes in that order. Joke, partly, but you notice he does say that, right? He's quoting all these different, even the Buddha himself, or all those other. So, so he's going to be saying this is really how this is the order in which experience happens. But I've wondered that same question, like, well, what, sometimes it would seem easier with a pot because I don't really care about a pot or something, or a chair or something, but he's saying this is the order in which because of, and somehow I guess it's, yeah, I'm not, I mean, obviously, he said that the substratum makes it easier. That's his, yeah, I've wondered the same thing. Other questions?
Yeah, Dr. Lauren, coming back to Lisa's question, so the few places where I've read this is like, once you realize emptiness, you'd be able to look at a phenomenon or an object and know the totality of it, sort of like the impermanence built into it, all natures within it, and all-knowing mind looks at it, right? I'm just wondering, like, so in that sense, like, if you look at a person, like, if I look at Fidel and I have realized emptiness, I'll know his past, present, and future, all of that.
No, actually, that's not true. I mean,
That's
only
scary, though.
the idea is only a Buddha. I mean, according to Buddhism, like so a person, an ordinary person, like say actually, well, definitely according to Buddhism, when a Buddha looks at a person, they know everything that's knowable about that person. But an ordinary, say a bodhisattva who's realized emptiness, who looks at a person, they don't know everything about that person, and they often point that out, like in scriptures, for example, like where, like so that's why a bodhisattva can still make a mistake in trying to help. Like when a bodhisattva is trying to help somebody, I mean they are very effective at helping, but they're not as effective as a Buddha because they don't know everything about that person's karma, for example. Only a Buddha knows everything about that. So a Buddha knows everything about that person, you could say. Their karma, what created and they say that there are certain subtle aspects of the karma, like, so somebody say, well, why is your ear shaped like this, and why is that even a bodhisattva can't answer that necessarily, but a Buddha can answer those. Like they know the karmic causes of all the different aspects of a person. Why is the person's personality this way, and they have this kind of thought pattern, and so on. So only a Buddha has that knowledge. But ordinary ordinary person who's realized emptiness, or without, but not yet directly, or even an Arya Bodhisattva on the first or second Bhumi, let's say, they don't know everything.
But on an object level, like if you look at a pot, you could see the subtle impermanence in a pot, like
yeah, I think they would know those things.
the decaying part of it, momentariness.
Yeah,
they would know that.
I think so. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's correct.
So that basically, I look at a pot and I already see that it's decaying, and there's no way I'm going to get attached to it. I mean, at a subtle level.
Yeah, if you realize subtle impermanence, then that will decrease attachment. It doesn't uproot it from the root. Only, right, as Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, only the realization of the emptiness of the pot will will uproot the deepest cause of your attachment. But if you realize subtle impermanence, at least it will suppress it, but it won't uproot it. Yeah.
So, like example, like So we know like projection is what brings us suffering, right? So why do you keep projecting? I mean, should be scared of projecting. There should be the amount
That's-
of scared.
Yeah, I agree, and that's exactly what Lama Tsongkhapa has been saying, though, is that we project true existence, particularly, right, inherent existence, and that causes our suffering, like you said.
Everything, yeah.
And then what he's saying, though, is we can't, the only way to stop that projecting is to recognize exactly what we're projecting and then realize that things don't exist in that way. And then that's the only way to stop it. Just wishing to stop it won't stop it.
Yeah, but by the time you're gonna realize that, the delusion already appeared.
The what already appeared?
The delusions. By the time you're gonna realize that, oh, it's because I'm thinking this way. The delusion already appeared because you just projected, then they appear.
Yeah, so that's why, again, like we have to repeatedly meditate on emptiness over and over and over
Uh-huh.
in order to get, because we've been habituated. Part of the answer to your question is we've got a deep habit of projecting. And so we have to counter that habit with a meditation on emptiness that's the only antidote. In a way, you could say that. Like if this is like a disease, projecting inherent existence is like a disease, the only cure, or the only antidote, the only cure to that disease is to meditate repeatedly on emptiness, and it's like taking, actually it's like, yeah, so it's like taking the cure over and over again until it uproots the disease. But you can't just like by wishing to stop it, or you can't force yourself, it has to be through habituation to this new approach.
So if everything is dependent arising, that means that things that cause things that cause anything to happen, that's also the result is the thing that causes something to happen is something which is going to cause it to cease. Example, like you get a sickness, right? You get like you get a sickness, right? So after, because that sickness is dependent arising, so something that causes that sickness is likely to make that disease go away. Because it's dependent arising.
Oh, I see,
Come
yeah,
from
yeah.
the same source, that means like it can go back to the same source using the same method.
Yeah, so we have to apply the antidote to that source, you mean?
Yes,
Right.
because like everything comes from emptiness, right? So then we're gonna negate everything comes naturally from emptiness. So that means emptiness is the one emptiness is the one which is gonna like make it back go to emptiness. Everything comes out of emptiness.
Hmm?
Single mind, like your clear mind, which is emptiness of clear mind or whatever.
Mm.
And then like they say like all delusion comes out of that. Then so that's why we apply the method like emptiness again to make it go back away.
Oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have put it that way, but that's interesting.
Yeah, because it's like a sickness. Like if everything is dependent on rising, that means any sickness that we experience, that means that something, the thing that caused that sickness is likely to make that disease go away.
I'll have to think about that. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
I mean seriously, because if everything is dependent on rising, right? Dependent on rising, that means like you can just sit down and then you can have faith and sit down, then anything can happen for you. If everything depends on rising, right?
Actually, one point though is important is that like so the cause, like if we think of what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, right? So the so the karma arises because of our mental afflictions, and our mental afflictions arise because we believe and grasp at our own projection of like attractiveness or ugliness and so on. We believe those because we believe our own, I'll call it projection or elaboration of inherent existence. And so that's the root cause, right? The root cause of all suffering is this projecting and believing, or elaboration, appearance, and then a belief in the appearance of inherent existence. And so that's the root cause of suffering. And so one important point, just to be clear, is that that cause, right, of belief in inherent existence only ever causes suffering. Actually, in the next verse, we'll cover it actually. In the next verse, he gets at this. But so we have to apply an antidote to that, and the antidote is the understanding of emptiness. So actually, I'll say this because I'm just continue on through this next little section because it explains more about this. So I'm gonna go. So he says,
Dr.
okay.
Lauren, but then one point to be understood is that that karma we're talking about is from past, present, and future, the 3 times we're talking here. So the delusion we are talking about, this is this instance of us talking. The karma we're talking about past, present, and future. It's carrying from billions of years of the notion of self, the innate I.
Yeah, that's true.
That's point. That makes more sense here. This discussion.
Yeah, grasping an eye,
Yeah.
it always comes from beginning, it has been there since beginning of time, that's true. So here, in the next section, I'll just start this section, because I think it helps with what we're talking about. So he said, the next, he says, in actual generation, the stages of the 2 views of selflessness. And so he's going to present them first the selflessness of persons, and then the selflessness of phenomena, right? And he explains why he's going to do it in that order is because that's the order in which we realize them. So now, settling the selflessness of persons. So first he says, there are 2 sections to that, right? One is identification of persons, and 2 is settling persons as not inherently existent. So the first one is, what's a person? It's interesting. Because if you're going to discuss the selflessness of persons, you have to know what's a person. And so he says, persons are of the 6 classes, right? So meaning the 6 realms, right? So, the 6 realms of samsara, right? God, demigod, human, and then animal, hungry ghost, and hell beings. Right? That's one way of categorizing them, is into the 6 realms. Another way of categorizing persons are ordinary persons and aryas, right? So that's a traditional Buddhist classification. Ordinary persons are anyone who's not realized emptiness directly. Aryas are anyone who has realized emptiness directly. And for a Buddhist perspective, that's a very important distinction, right? Because ordinary people don't understand reality directly, and Aryas do. Then another way of defining persons, right, is accumulators of white and black karma. Another way of describing it is the experiencers of those white and black karmas, right? Another description of persons is those revolving in cyclic existence, or the cultivators of the paths for the sake of liberation, and the attainers of those, right? So you can categorize there 3, right? Those who are stuck in samsara completely, those who are practicing and progressing along the paths to liberation from samsara, and those who have achieved the result of those, right? So the result ones could be Buddhas, or Arhats, or Pratyeka Buddhas, right? And then those practicing them would be those on the paths of those 3, right? So the Bodhisattvas would be on the path to a Buddha, and so on. So he's just giving different ways of categorizing what's a person. But then he says, commenting on the meaning of the sutras that teach the self is to be merely imputed on the aggregates. So now he's quoting a sutra which was quoted in Chandrakirti's commentary on the Middle Way. This is getting at the point I was just talking about. So the first verse here is talking about ultimate truths, and the second verse is talking about conventional. And I'm going to start with this. So the first line, the so-called, and this is the Buddha talking, right? A sutra. The so-called self is, here he says, a fiendish mind. Fiendish here is an interesting, they sometimes call it, other translators call it a demon mind, or a Mara. In Buddhism we talk about Mara, right? So he's saying, the mind of self-grasping is a Mara, right? Is like a demon. I think that's it, yeah, fiendish, whatever. Let's say Mara, right? So Mara means like cause of suffering, right? Or and demon means cause of suffering. So the so-called self is a demonic mind, or is a Mara, mind of Mara, right? A Mara mind. And you have come to hold this view, right? So this view is the view of the transitory collection that we've been talking about so much, right? So the view that grasps at an inherently existent I and mind. The compositional aggregates are empty. There is no sentient being here. And so here, this verse, I just think this is quite interesting. This first verse is talking about ultimate truth, right? And so it's saying, it's interesting, right? So the first part of it, right, where we're saying it's like a Mara, it's getting at what we've been talking about. Why do you want to meditate on emptiness? For that reason, right? Because that mind of self-grasping is our inner enemy. Right? It's the cause of all our suffering. And for somebody who's come to hold the view that of self-grasping, right? They have to meditate like this on ultimate truth, which is the compositional aggregates are empty, right? Here you're saying you're searching the aggregates for self, right? So you're searching your own body and mind, right? Which are the aggregates, right? We usually say 5, right? Form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness. So you're searching those for self, and what you find is there is no sentient being here. Right? Sentient being in this sense, it's not talking about the conventionally existent self, right? They're talking about the object of negation. So when they say no sentient being, they mean an inherently existent. Like, so you're searching for an inherently existent sentient being, and you find there is no sentient being here. And you realize emptiness, right? The ultimate truth. Then the second verse, right? Just as based on the collection of parts people speak of a chariot, or of chariots, likewise, in dependence upon the aggregates, conventionally they say sentient beings. So here he's saying sentient being, the conventional truth is sentient beings do exist. How do they exist? As merely labeled on the, conventionally labeled, right, or designated, say. People speak of chariots, right? So the analogy is a chariot, right? And actually, Chandrakirti goes into humongous detail using this analogy of a chariot. If you study his Majjhimaka Avatara, right? And he has different ways of analyzing a chariot. But the chariot is a metaphor or an example that is then applying to us, right? And so, what he said, right? And so here he's saying, the I, how does the, the conventional truth is in the second verse. How does the I exist? It exists as a mere something people speak of, right? A mere convention that's labeled on the collection of the parts, meaning the aggregates. Just like a chariot, like a car, right? We label car on the basis of the parts of a car, right? We label person on the basis of the parts of mind and body. So the idea he's getting at here is, actually it's interesting, right? And actually there are a lot of profound, I'll read what Lama Tsongkhapa says and I'll make a couple points about it. And then we'll probably stop with this paragraph. So he says, the first verse indicates the selflessness of persons, that ultimately persons do not exist. The first line says that the apprehension of a self of persons is like a Mara, a demon, a fiend, whatever. The second one says, those who apprehend in this manner are under the power of bad views. And the third and fourth say the aggregates are empty of a self of persons. The second verse indicates that persons do exist conventionally. More specifically, the first and second lines present an analogy, and the last two connect it to the meaning, indicating that persons are merely imputed to the aggregates. So a couple things. One is, in terms of what we've been talking about and what I was just saying, like the self-grasping is like the Mara, right, the demon that causes suffering. And we have to realize emptiness to become liberated from that. And before I was using the analogy of a disease, here using the analogy of it more like a demon, right? That's what he's saying. And so it's like the only way to exorcise that demon, if we're doing an exorcism, would be to realize emptiness. So you're doing your own exorcism on yourself, but the demon is not some external demon, it's your own self-grasping, and the exorcism is done by realizing emptiness, right? Which is, what's the word? Banishing ignorance from your mind, right? And actually there's a famous line, teaching from Shantideva, where he says, like actually it would be like external enemies, whether they be like an enemy army, or even over an external demon or something. If you conquer them, they can go somewhere else and wait and hide, right? He says, but and then they can come back and hurt you again, which is actually what happens, isn't it? But Shantideva says, when you're fighting an enemy, an inner enemy that's in your own consciousness, it has no place else to go. In other words, if you go deep enough into your own inner experience, that enemy can't go somewhere else. Right? There's no place, because it's inside you. So if you conquer that enemy, it will never come back. And that's why they say the true warrior conquers. Buddha said that, right? The true warrior conquers themselves.
Will never come back, or or it becomes your slave.
Or becomes what?
Your slave.
Your slave.
You
Yeah.
use it however you want.
Yeah, for this one though, it actually gets destroyed because it wasn't real in the first place. Self-grasping, you know, the object of self-grasping. Other ones, yeah, you were true.
Because like Lama Tsongkhapa says, like, I'm going to defeat it, then control it.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
No, there's truth in some cases for that.
yeah.
And then here, I just want to point out one more point before we stop, because it's important in the second verse. And it's interesting, right? He's actually saying, so how does the I, Chandrakirti and the Buddha here in Lama Tsongkhapa are saying, how does the I exist? Right? So he's saying, independence upon, like the sort of, you could say the mere appearance, or the mere aggregation of things, of parts, it's labeled. Right? And one point I just want to make, which is what we're going to get into as we go along in the text, is, you know, in some way, in some sense, you could say, we can say, the second verse implies the truth of the first, or explains the truth of the first, right? Also, because if you understand the conventional truth, which is that how does the I exist? It exists as a mere dependent origination, right? There's a mere appearance of parts, aggregates, and a mere label, right? Well, something that exists in that way, as merely labeled on a conglextion, doesn't really exist from the side of the object, right? And something that doesn't exist from the side of the object can exist in this merely dependently arisen way. So we're going to get into this point that these two verses, he's not emphasizing this here, but it's true, they get at a point which is the harmony, or the, sometimes we say the synonyms, actually, right? Sometimes they'll say dependent origination and emptiness are synonyms, even, right? Other times we can say they're in harmony. Or we can say, like, you have to, and if you correctly understand, this is the last point I'll make today, is, this is making two, so one point is making is, things do exist in through mere designation, so they're not non-existent. That protects us from nihilism. Right? But there is no sentient being here. There's no truly existent, inherently existent sentient being here. Protects us from self-grasping, right, or from ignorance, from permanent, the extreme of permanence, we sometimes say. And what we have to understand as we go along and continue studying emptiness is that is this harmony of dependent origination and emptiness, right? That emptiness doesn't imply complete non-existence; it implies a subtle level of dependent origination, and dependent origination implies emptiness. So we'll stop there. Continue on next time.